was accused of being a criminal. Which of the members of this committee would tolerate such behavior if they were the victim? In its great wisdom, this government appointed Mr. Beauregard as president. This committee must now unanimously ensure that justice prevails and that this great Canadian agency is salvaged. To that end, I would urge the committee to consider the following recommendations. First, to remove from Mr. Beauregard's record the evaluation report, including the chair's note and all other relevant documents, so that his name and honor can be redeemed once and for all. Second, to call on the Board of Directors of Rights and Democracy to issue an apology to Mr. Beauregard's family. Third, to call on the Chair, Mr. Brown, and the Vice Chair, Mr. Gauthier, and Mr. Tepper to resign because of their misconduct. And fourth, to consider reconstituting the entire Board of Directors in view of the tremendous damage to Rights and Democracy's international reputation and the loss of confidence by the Canadian public. That concludes my submission, Mr. Chair. I thank you and the committee for your kind attention.
And thank you, Mr. Akhavan. What we're going to do now is we're going to start over on my left-hand side here with Mr. Ray, 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to just make je veux faire une intervention très brève.
I just want to make a brief comment, because I never said this clearly to the committee, that as a former leader of the official opposition Ontario and as a former Prime Minister of the province, I can tell you all very clearly, I knew Rémy Beauregard very, very well. I worked very closely with him, and I always found him to be a man of great intelligence and great integrity. And I have to say that because knowing him as I did over several years, I was, quite frankly, surprised by the comments that I read and heard, like others did. Now, I would like to thank Ms. Trépanier for her courage in coming forward today. And in giving a very important perspective on the conflict that clearly existed within the board. And I think that these are statements that we cannot disregard, because they testify to the problems that clearly existed within the board and the problems that ensued. And my first question is to Mr. Akhavan.
I was reading an article by Mr. Cooper April the 7th in the Calgary Herald. Mr. Cooper is a professor at the University of Calgary. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He claims to have received information from a member of the board, Mr. Marco Navarro Geni, in which he states that between May 2009 and January 2010, Beauregard managed to turn, I'm quoting from Mr. Cooper's article, managed to turn several international members of the board against the Performance Review Committee by granting them favors, including travel perks, interns, and funding for projects in their home countries. These are serious allegations. Again, there seems to be a pattern on the part of board members of making very consequential allegations against Mr. Beauregard, which he's not in a position to respond to, which I must say I find deplorable. But since you are or were a member of the board, could you comment on this, and could you also comment on any allegation with respect to any conflicts which you yourself may have been under or allegedly were under during your time as a member of the board?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ray. Rights and Democracy had three very distinguished international members. Mr. Riveros Frank of Bolivia, as I mentioned, was consulted by Minister Kent, Minister Fletcher on democracy promotion in the Americas. Ms. Sima Samar is a recipient of the Order of Canada, one of the only people other than Nelson Mandela. Ms. Soyata Mega is the African Human Rights Commissioner on women's issues. So to make this kind of defamatory accusations against them, I think speaks to the attitude, frankly speaking, of the board and exactly what they did to Rémy Beauregard and anyone that stood in their way. Now, what's interesting is that the idea is that because a student intern was sent to Bamako, Mali, to assist Ms. Soyata Mega, that was the way that Rémy bought her vote. I mean, that's just astonishing to suggest that Sima Samar, who received $8 million for the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission from CEDA over the years, was being bought by Mr. Beauregard. And the same accusation, which appeared strategically yesterday in CanWest, where I'm accused of having requested a nomination to a UN position, which is absolutely baseless. I have the email right before you where I asked for the advice of Mr. Beauregard in relation to a commission of inquiry for war crimes in Sri Lanka, which was not established by the UN and which this government promoted and which members of this government wanted me to participate in. I asked for his advice about a possible nomination. But if the greatest accusation they can come up against me is that I wanted to help the victims of mass murder in Sri Lanka, well, I stand guilty as charged. We have to remember that they have hired a private investigative firm and spent tens of thousands of dollars to go through thousands of Rémy Beauregard's emails. And this is the best accusation that they can come up with. I think they're not getting good value for their money.
Do you have any idea how CanWest would have received that email? I mean, presumably it's proprietorial to the board and proprietorial to the organization as well as to the investigative firm that was doing the work of going through the emails. Is that right?
Well, of course. It's the same way that Ezra Levant and Gerald Steinberg and others were given internal documents. But if I may just add, what I find astonishing is that Mr. Navarro Jenny is making these accusations. Before Mr. Beauregard's death, I was exercising my duty of care as a board member, looking at the books of the board, and I noticed, for example, that Mr. Navarro Jenny had been in Haiti on a mission of rights and democracy, and this was the same mission that Mr. Riveros Frank had gone on earlier with the accusations of travel perks. Mr. Navarro Jenny stayed 4 extra days for personal purposes, and he charged rights and democracy and received $1,300 for 4 days in which he stayed beyond the mandate entrusted to him by rights and democracy. I was astonished to learn as well that Mr. Jacques Gauthier, who had gone on a 6-day trip to China, received 11 days of fees from Rights and Democracy, totaling $3,575, whereas the other members of the delegation received $500 honorariums. And if I may just add, the budget of the board, which was $130,000 for the previous fiscal year, was already approaching $300,000 when I left the board. And a big part of that were honoraria that were paid to board members who come here and speak as if they're volunteers. The honoraria, which were budgeted at $40,000, were approaching $80,000 by the time I left the board. So it's very unfortunate, really, that they need to now start smearing the international members.
What is the practice with respect to board? Board members are paid by under order in council. I mean, how does it? Can you make me familiar with what the pattern is?
Mr. Akhavan, I'll just get you to finish with that answer and we'll move on, but go ahead.
Yes, board members are paid an honorarium for every full day of work that they do, and not for full days of work that they don't do.
If they travel, I mean, under what conditions do board members travel? Do they get the permission of the chairman of the board to go on a mission or something, and then they get paid for that, and their expenses are also covered?
Well, yes, expenses are covered, and getting back to Mr. Gauthier, if you are on a 6-day trip to China, why are you getting 11 days honorarium? So, I'm afraid that there will be further revelations that will have to be made about some of the payments that were made. If I may just conclude, one of the issues we have to consider is that Mr. Navarro Jenny, who's been